The fastest way to discover who thinks they own your property is to improve it. The sharp rhythm of nail guns echoed across the hillside as the morning sun spilled over the valley behind my backyard. Fresh-cut cedar filled the cool air, pickup trucks lined the curb, and a crew of contractors carefully measured every post before lowering it into perfectly aligned concrete footings. I stood with a rolled set of approved building plans tucked beneath my arm, sipping black coffee while watching years of planning finally become reality. My name is Nathan Brooks, and after nearly 20 years working as a civil engineer, I had finally purchased the home my family had dreamed about for longer than I cared to admit. It was not the largest house in the neighborhood, and it certainly was not the most expensive, but it sat on a quiet hillside with enough backyard space to enjoy privacy without feeling isolated. The original wooden fence had survived decades of weather, leaning just enough to remind everyone that its best years were long behind it. Replacing it had been on my project list since the day we moved in, and after months of permits, surveys, contractor meetings, and design revisions, construction had finally begun. Everything was progressing exactly according to schedule until I heard slow footsteps crunching across the gravel driveway behind me. "You need to stop this immediately." I turned and found a woman standing several feet away with her arms folded, oversized sunglasses resting on top of carefully styled blonde hair, and the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to giving instructions instead of asking questions. I recognized her almost instantly. Patricia Morgan, president of our Homeowners Association. We had spoken only a handful of times since I moved into the neighborhood, always briefly and always politely. At first, I assumed she wanted to verify that the project complied with community guidelines, something I had already confirmed months earlier. Instead, she looked directly at one of the newly installed fence posts before shifting her attention toward the valley stretching beyond my property. "That fence is blocking my view," she said without introducing herself or asking a single question about the project. I glanced toward the open hillside and then back at her, honestly believing I had misunderstood what she meant. My fence sat entirely inside my surveyed property line and followed every approved specification required by both the county and the Homeowners Association. "It is replacing the old fence," I answered calmly. "Same location, fully permitted." She shook her head as though paperwork had nothing to do with the conversation. "The old one leaned lower," she replied. "From my patio, I could see much more of the valley. This new fence ruins that." For a brief moment, I thought she might be joking, but her expression never changed. Around us, contractors continued measuring lumber, concrete mixers hummed softly, and levels clicked against fresh posts while no one interrupted their work. I looked once more at the stamped permit folded beneath my arm, then back toward Patricia. What she could not possibly know was that every complaint she was about to make, every email she would send, and every demand she believed would stop my project would eventually become the foundation of the smartest property investment I had ever made. Most people looked at the hillside behind my house and saw a beautiful panoramic view stretching for miles across rolling trees and distant ridgelines. I saw something much simpler. I saw the backyard where my wife wanted to drink coffee before work, where our grandchildren could eventually play without wandering too close to the slope, and where our family could finally enjoy a little peace after years of living in crowded neighborhoods. Buying that property had not been an impulse. It represented nearly 2 decades of overtime, careful budgeting, and more weekends spent reviewing engineering drawings than relaxing on a fishing boat. Every improvement we planned had one purpose: making the property safer, more durable, and more comfortable without disturbing anyone around us. The fence replacement was part of that long-term plan from the beginning. The original cedar fence leaned noticeably in several places after years of storms and shifting soil, leaving uneven gaps that offered very little privacy and even less structural confidence. Before hiring a single contractor, I commissioned a licensed land survey to confirm every property corner, reviewed county building requirements, studied the Homeowners Association design standards, and submitted every document requested during the approval process. Weeks later, I received written approval from both the county and the Architectural Review Committee. I kept printed copies of every permit inside a weatherproof folder because experience had taught me that paperwork often settled disagreements much faster than opinions. Standing in my backyard that morning, I genuinely believed the difficult part was already behind me. Patricia, however, clearly viewed the situation differently. She slowly walked closer to the newly installed fence posts and studied the construction with narrowed eyes before turning back toward the valley below. She explained that she had enjoyed an uninterrupted view across my backyard for years and believed the replacement fence should remain lower than the approved design so residents behind my property could continue appreciating the scenery. I politely explained that the previous fence had appeared lower only because years of weather had caused sections to lean several inches out of alignment. The replacement followed the exact approved height measured from finished grade, exactly as shown on the construction plans. She dismissed the explanation with a small wave of her hand, as though engineering measurements carried less weight than personal preference. One of the contractors quietly approached me to confirm the next post location. After reviewing the measurement, I gave a simple nod and watched the crew continue working. Patricia remained where she was, silently observing every step. Before leaving, she told me this conversation was not over and suggested I reconsider the project before it became a larger issue with the Homeowners Association. I answered respectfully that I would gladly discuss any concerns supported by the governing documents or applicable regulations. She offered no specific rule, only another disappointed look toward the valley before walking back across the neighboring lawn. I watched her disappear behind the row of homes overlooking the hillside, then looked down at the permit folder resting against my truck. Something about the confidence in her voice told me that replacing an aging fence had quietly become something much larger than a construction project. And although I did not know exactly how far the disagreement would go, I had already decided that every conversation, every email, and every document from that day forward would be carefully preserved. The construction continued throughout the afternoon exactly as scheduled, and by sunset nearly half of the old fence had been removed and replaced with perfectly aligned cedar panels. The steady sound of saws, levels clicking into place, and cordless drills echoed across the hillside, while the smell of fresh lumber drifted through the neighborhood. I thought Patricia's visit had been nothing more than an unpleasant conversation until the first email arrived before breakfast the following morning. The message carried the subject line, "Immediate Community Concern," and claimed my construction was negatively affecting neighboring properties. Attached were several photographs of my backyard taken from different angles, including images clearly captured from locations overlooking my property. I read the email twice before opening the permit folder resting on my desk. Every measurement matched the approved drawings exactly. I replied politely, attaching copies of the county permit and the Homeowners Association approval letter, thanking her for sharing her concerns while confirming that construction remained fully compliant with every applicable requirement. Less than 2 hours later, another email appeared. This one suggested lowering the completed fence by nearly 18 inches so surrounding homeowners could continue enjoying what she described as the established neighborhood view. Again, no rule accompanied the request, only personal preference presented as though it carried legal authority. Over the next several days, the pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency. Patricia stopped by the construction site almost every afternoon, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by another board member, carefully watching each stage of the project before asking the contractors questions they politely directed back to me. She photographed new sections of fencing, measured shadows with her phone, and occasionally stood near the property line studying the valley beyond, as though hoping the landscape itself would somehow support her position. My contractors remained professional. They continued following the engineered plans, checking elevations, confirming measurements, and documenting progress with photographs before closing each workday. Every evening, I added Patricia's emails, printed photographs, construction reports, permits, inspection records, and contractor invoices to a growing binder stored inside my home office. Years of engineering had taught me that careful documentation often became the strongest voice in any disagreement because facts remain consistent long after emotions change. One afternoon, while reviewing security camera footage from the previous evening, I noticed something unexpected. After the construction crew had left, Patricia walked along the edge of her backyard, paused near the shared property line, and leaned several feet beyond the survey markers while looking across my yard toward the valley below. A few minutes later, another neighbor joined her, and together they remained there quietly talking while standing noticeably closer to my backyard than I remembered seeing before. The video revealed nothing hostile or dramatic, but it sparked a question I had never considered. If the view everyone wanted depended on standing near my property instead of their own, perhaps the disagreement had never been about the fence itself. Perhaps it had always been about where people believed they were entitled to stand. That single realization changed the way I looked at every complaint, every photograph, and every carefully worded email that continued arriving in my inbox. Because for the first time I suspected the real issue was hidden several feet beyond the fence rather than inside it. The following Monday morning, I called the licensed survey company that had completed my original property survey and asked them to return for one final verification before construction reached the last section of fencing. I did not make the appointment because I believed the boundary had changed. I made it because experience had taught me that confidence becomes much stronger when supported by current documentation instead of old assumptions. 2 days later, the survey crew arrived with tripods, measuring equipment, GPS receivers, and stacks of field notes. Bright orange survey flags appeared one by one along every property corner, while the technicians carefully confirmed each monument recorded on the original plat. I walked beside them only when they asked a question, otherwise allowing them to complete their work without interruption. Patricia noticed the activity almost immediately. Within 15 minutes, she was standing near the edge of her backyard watching every measurement with obvious curiosity. She never crossed onto my property, but she remained close enough to follow the crew as they worked their way down the hillside. By late afternoon, the lead surveyor handed me an updated signed drawing confirming exactly what I already believed. Every fence post sat completely inside my property line with the required setbacks fully intact. Before leaving, he pointed toward a narrow strip of level ground running alongside the new fence and casually mentioned something I found far more interesting than the survey itself. Judging by the worn grass and repeated foot traffic, people had apparently been standing there for quite some time. That observation immediately reminded me of the security camera footage I had reviewed several nights earlier. Curious, I spent the evening examining recordings from previous weeks instead of focusing only on the recent construction period. As I moved backward through the saved files, a consistent pattern slowly emerged. On clear evenings, Patricia frequently walked toward the rear corner of her yard before stepping beyond the landscaping and stopping near the boundary markers separating our properties. Sometimes she stood alone while watching the sunset over the valley. Other evenings, friends or visitors joined her. The recordings never showed anyone causing damage or behaving aggressively, but they clearly demonstrated that the best viewing angle did not come from Patricia's patio. It came from the narrow section of land entirely inside my property. The realization explained every conversation we had shared since construction began. The fence itself had never been the true obstacle. The real issue was that my improved fence made it much more obvious where my property ended and everyone else's expectations began. The following morning, another certified letter from the Homeowners Association arrived requesting that I voluntarily modify the fence to preserve what Patricia described as the neighborhood's traditional scenic enjoyment. I read every page carefully before placing it inside the same binder that already contained permits, inspection reports, photographs, emails, survey drawings, contractor records, and security still images. By then, the binder had grown thick enough that it barely closed. Looking at the organized stack of documents spread across my desk, I realized something important. Patricia believed she was building a stronger case against my fence, but with every email she sent and every complaint she documented, she was quietly helping me build an even stronger record proving exactly why my property rights deserved to remain protected. By the end of that week, the construction itself had become the least interesting part of my daily routine. The fence was progressing exactly as designed. Inspections continued without a single correction, and every contractor on site remained ahead of schedule. What occupied my attention instead was the growing collection of documents filling the binder on my desk. Every email from Patricia, every certified letter from the Homeowners Association, every survey drawing, every inspection report, and every security camera image fit together like pieces of a puzzle that neither she nor the board seemed to realize they were assembling for me. Rather than responding emotionally, I decided it was time to understand every legal detail surrounding my property as thoroughly as I understood its engineering. I scheduled a meeting with a local real estate attorney who specialized in property rights and land use disputes. I arrived carrying the binder, expecting a brief consultation. Instead, we spent nearly 2 hours reviewing every page in chronological order. The attorney paused several times to ask questions about the repeated references to preserving the neighborhood view. He explained that while homeowners often enjoyed attractive scenery, there was no automatic legal right to maintain a view across someone else's privately owned land unless a recorded easement or specific covenant granted that protection. He searched the recorded property documents, reviewed the subdivision restrictions, and confirmed that no scenic easement existed on my lot. My ownership rights were exactly what I believed they were. Before leaving his office, he offered one piece of advice that stayed with me. "Do not argue with opinions," he said. "Continue collecting facts." That sentence became my strategy moving forward. At his recommendation, I also contacted a professional land planning consultant to review the relationship between the completed fence, the survey, and the surrounding topography. Together we walked the property while discussing elevations, sight lines, drainage, and access routes. Standing near the rear corner of my backyard, he smiled and pointed toward the exact location repeatedly appearing in my security footage. From there, the valley opened into a nearly perfect panoramic view, one that disappeared almost entirely from neighboring patios only a few feet away. The difference was subtle until someone physically occupied that narrow strip of land inside my property boundary. Suddenly, everything made sense. Patricia had never been fighting to lower the fence simply because she disliked its appearance. She wanted unrestricted access to the visual angle that existed only from my side of the survey line. Later that evening, I returned to the backyard just before sunset. Warm orange light reflected across the unfinished fence while a gentle breeze moved through the trees below the hillside. I stood exactly where the consultant had indicated and quietly watched the landscape stretch across the horizon. It truly was an incredible view. At that moment, an idea formed so naturally that I actually laughed to myself. If everyone insisted that this particular location held such extraordinary value, perhaps it was finally time to acknowledge that value instead of pretending it belonged to the entire neighborhood. I folded the updated survey, placed it beside the attorney's notes inside the binder, and called my contractor the following morning with one unexpected design change that would transform the entire project in a way no one on the Homeowners Association board would ever anticipate. The contractor arrived at my house just after 8 o'clock the next morning carrying a stack of revised material samples instead of the standard cedar panels we had originally planned for the final section overlooking the valley. He spread everything across the tailgate of his truck while sunlight reflected off polished metal frames and thick transparent panels unlike anything I had ever considered installing around a backyard. We spent nearly an hour reviewing engineering specifications, wind load calculations, installation requirements, and long-term maintenance costs before I made my decision. Instead of finishing the remaining 60 feet with cedar, I approved a custom system built from laminated bullet-resistant architectural glass secured inside powder-coated steel supports. It was not chosen because I expected danger. It was selected because the material offered exceptional durability, outstanding weather resistance, and complete transparency without sacrificing privacy where strategic landscaping already existed. Every measurement remained exactly within the approved plans. The height did not change by a single inch. Only the material changed. Because the modification remained fully compliant with county regulations and Homeowners Association design standards, the contractor simply submitted the updated material specifications for the project file before ordering fabrication. 3 weeks later, a flatbed truck slowly climbed the winding road into our neighborhood, carrying massive glass panels protected inside padded transport racks. Curious neighbors stepped outside as cranes carefully lifted each section into place. Even Patricia stood across the street, silently watching while the installers positioned the crystal-clear wall along the final stretch overlooking the hillside. The finished result was striking. Sunlight flowed through the transparent panels without interruption, reflecting blue skies during the day and golden sunsets each evening. From inside my backyard, the view remained spectacular, while the reinforced glass created a clean architectural appearance unlike any fence in the community. Several neighbors complimented the design before the installation crew had even packed their equipment. Patricia said nothing. She simply stared through the glass toward the valley with an expression I could not quite read. A few days later, I reviewed my security cameras as part of my normal routine. The footage confirmed exactly what I had anticipated. Although the new glass allowed anyone standing inside my backyard to enjoy the scenery, people standing on neighboring lots still could not experience the same viewing angle because the hillside geometry had never changed. The only place where the panorama fully opened remained the narrow strip of land inside my property line identified by the surveyor weeks earlier. Over the following evenings, the cameras quietly recorded Patricia approaching the boundary several times before stopping where the landscaping naturally separated our properties. She would study the transparent fence for several moments, glance toward the valley, then slowly walk away. Watching those recordings, I realized the disagreement had reached a turning point. She had succeeded in proving that the fence itself was never blocking her view. The landscape had always belonged to nature, but the best place to appreciate it belonged to my property. With every passing day, the value of that small section of land became more obvious, and the idea that first appeared during my conversation with the attorney no longer seemed unusual. It seemed completely logical. If someone believed access to that exact location carried measurable value, then perhaps it should finally be treated like every other valuable use of private property, through permission, clear agreements, and fair compensation rather than expectation. A week after the installation was complete, I placed a small bronze plaque beside the gate leading into my backyard. It was simple, professionally engraved, and mounted neatly on a cedar post where anyone approaching the property could read it without stepping inside. The sign explained that the scenic overlook located beyond the gate was private property and that access required the owner's written permission. Beneath those words was a laminated information sheet inside a weatherproof holder describing a voluntary short-term scenic access license available by appointment. It included a modest hourly fee, basic liability language, and a reminder that all visitors must remain within the designated viewing area. There was nothing sarcastic about it, nothing insulting. Everything had been reviewed by my attorney before I printed the first copy. I viewed it as no different from allowing photographers to use private farmland or permitting wedding parties to reserve a picturesque garden for an afternoon. If people believed the location had genuine value, then treating that value professionally seemed entirely reasonable. 2 days later, while watering newly planted shrubs along the transparent fence, I noticed Patricia walking toward my driveway with determined steps. She stopped beside the plaque, read every line without speaking, then turned to face me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and frustration. She asked whether I was actually serious. I smiled politely and answered that the overlook had always been part of my private property and that I simply wanted to establish clear expectations after learning how many people appreciated the view. She immediately pointed toward the glass fence and insisted that I could not possibly expect neighbors to pay simply to enjoy scenery that had existed long before I purchased the house. I calmly replied that no one was being charged to look at the valley. The valley belonged to everyone who could naturally see it from their own property. The optional license applied only to entering and using my privately owned land for the specific viewing location identified by the recent survey. There was an important legal difference between appreciating a landscape and occupying someone else's property to experience it. Patricia folded her arms and reminded me that the Homeowners Association valued community cooperation. I answered that cooperation worked best when it respected clearly defined property rights. She left without another word. Later that evening, my security cameras captured several board members quietly gathering near the property line, reading the plaque, comparing copies of what appeared to be the association guidelines, and discussing something among themselves before eventually walking away. The following afternoon, I received another certified letter from the Homeowners Association requesting that I attend the next board meeting to discuss what they described as concerns regarding neighborhood harmony. I placed the unopened envelope beside the growing binder that had accompanied me through every stage of the project. By then, the binder contained months of permits, surveys, legal opinions, inspection reports, photographs, emails, security records, and construction documents arranged in perfect chronological order. Looking at it resting on my desk beside the access license agreement, I realized the conversation was no longer about fences, views, or landscaping. It had become a discussion about whether private ownership still meant something when someone else disliked the boundaries. And for the first time since construction began, I felt completely prepared for whatever came next. The Homeowners Association meeting took place the following Thursday evening inside the neighborhood clubhouse, a building I had only visited once before when we first moved into the community. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood, and nearly every folding chair had been filled long before the meeting officially began. Word about the glass fence and the scenic access agreement had spread much faster than I expected. Some neighbors smiled politely as I walked in carrying the now familiar binder, while others quietly whispered to one another before taking their seats. Patricia sat at the front beside the other board members with a neatly organized stack of papers resting in front of her. When the meeting reached the agenda item concerning my property, she stood and explained that the association believed my access agreement was inconsistent with the spirit of the community. She carefully avoided saying it violated any specific rule. Instead, she repeated that the arrangement encouraged division among neighbors and transformed a shared scenic experience into something commercial. When she finished, the board invited me to respond. I placed the binder on the table, opened it to the first section, and began with the county building permit. Next came the approved architectural review documents signed before construction ever started. Then I presented the updated property survey confirming every fence post remained entirely inside my lot. After that, I provided the attorney's written opinion explaining that no recorded scenic easement or covenant granted neighboring owners any legal right to preserve a view across privately owned property. Finally, I displayed several still photographs captured from my security cameras, not to accuse anyone of misconduct, but simply to demonstrate that the viewing location everyone wanted existed entirely within my surveyed property boundary. The room became noticeably quieter as each document was passed from one board member to another. One director asked whether anyone had ever been required to purchase the scenic access license. I answered truthfully that no one had. It was entirely optional and had never prevented anyone from enjoying the landscape visible from their own homes. Another board member asked whether I intended to remove the program if requested. I respectfully explained that I would always consider reasonable requests, but I would not surrender a lawful use of my property simply because others preferred unrestricted access to land they did not own. After nearly 30 minutes of discussion, the association's legal counsel, who had joined the meeting remotely, summarized the issue in remarkably simple terms. The fence complied with every applicable requirement. The property survey was valid. No governing document guaranteed neighboring views across private land. The access agreement involved only voluntary entry onto my property with the owner's permission. Therefore, the association had no authority to compel changes or prohibit the arrangement. Patricia remained silent for several moments after hearing that conclusion. The board quietly voted to close the matter without further action. As neighbors slowly gathered their belongings and conversations resumed around the room, several people approached me, not to argue, but to compliment the appearance of the new fence and thank me for presenting everything so professionally. Walking out into the cool evening air with the binder tucked beneath my arm, I realized the strongest part of my defense had never been the glass, the survey, or even the attorney's opinion. It had been patience, because while others relied on assumptions, I had spent months collecting facts that eventually spoke louder than either of us ever could. Several months have passed since that meeting, and every morning when I step onto my back patio with a cup of coffee, the first thing I notice is not the glass fence or the sweeping valley beyond it. It is the quiet. The steady breeze still moves through the trees below the hillside. Birds still drift across the morning sky, and sunlight still reflects across the transparent panels exactly the way it did on the day they were installed. The neighborhood eventually returned to its normal routine, and so did I. My family enjoys the backyard without wondering who might suddenly appear near the property line, and the carefully designed landscaping has matured enough to create the peaceful retreat we imagined when we first purchased the house. The scenic access agreement remains posted beside the gate exactly where it has always been, although very few people have ever asked about it after the Homeowners Association meeting settled the issue. A local photographer reserved the overlook one autumn afternoon to capture engagement pictures overlooking the changing leaves and later a landscape artist requested permission to spend an evening painting the sunset from the designated viewing area. Both appointments were arranged professionally. Both respected the property, and both reminded me that there is nothing unreasonable about allowing people to appreciate something valuable through mutual respect instead of entitlement. Patricia and I still see each other from time to time during neighborhood events. Our conversations are brief, polite, and noticeably different from those first tense weeks of construction. She no longer comments on the fence, and I no longer feel the need to explain why it exists. The issue that once dominated every email and board discussion quietly disappeared the moment everyone accepted the simple truth that private property does not become public simply because it offers a beautiful view. Looking back, I realized the most important lesson had very little to do with architecture, engineering, or even legal documents. The real lesson was that preparation creates confidence. Every permit I requested before construction began, every survey I ordered, every inspection I scheduled, every photograph I saved, and every respectful reply I sent became another piece of a foundation much stronger than concrete. None of those records existed to defeat another person. They existed to protect what my family had worked so hard to build. I often think back to the moment Patricia first walked toward the construction site and told me the new fence was ruining her view. At the time, those words sounded like the beginning of an argument. Now they feel more like the beginning of an education. Had she never objected, I probably would have completed an ordinary cedar fence and moved on with life. Instead, I invested in a lasting improvement that enhanced the property, clarified its boundaries, and ultimately increased its value while resolving a misunderstanding that had existed long before I ever moved into the neighborhood. Standing there today as the evening sun turns the glass into a ribbon of gold stretching across the hillside, I understand something that years of engineering alone never taught me. The strongest boundaries are not built with thicker materials or taller fences. They are built with patience, careful planning, documented facts, and quiet confidence. Justice is rarely loud, but when it finally arrives, it stands as clear as glass for everyone willing to see it.